The aircraft was cruising at a stable altitude, its engines humming steadily as it cut through the night sky. Inside the cockpit, the instruments showed nothing unusual. Airspeed was normal. Altitude was steady. Weather radar displayed scattered clouds, nothing the crew hadn't handled countless times before. To the passengers, this was just another routine flight, quiet, uneventful, forgettable. But inside the aircraft's systems, something had already begun to go wrong. A single sensor, small and easily overlooked, started feeding incorrect data into the flight computers. The pilots had no visual indication that this information was wrong. The numbers looked believable. The alarms stayed silent. And because modern aircraft rely heavily on automated systems, the plane quietly adjusted itself based on data that was slowly drifting away from reality. Minutes passed. The autopilot made subtle corrections, slight changes in pitch, tiny adjustments in thrust. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would immediately alert the crew. The pilots monitored the instruments, trusting the systems that had been designed to assist them. After thousands of safe flights across the world, there was no reason to doubt them now. Then, without warning, the first alert sounded. It wasn't a catastrophic alarm. Just a brief chime. A minor caution. Something pilots are trained to handle calmly. The crew acknowledged it, discussed possible causes, and continued flying. But what they didn't realize was that this alert was the first visible crack in a chain of failures already unfolding beneath the surface. As the aircraft continued forward, the incorrect data spread through multiple systems. Flight computers began disagreeing with each other. One showed a normal condition. Another hinted at a developing problem. The cockpit, once calm and orderly, slowly filled with conflicting information. The pilots were now forced to question what they were seeing. And somewhere deep inside the aircraft, the black box was recording every sound, every word, every decision, capturing a truth that would only be discovered long after the flight had vanished from the sky. As the flight pushed deeper into the night, the cockpit atmosphere began to change. The instruments no longer told a single, clear story. One screen suggested the aircraft was flying too fast, while another hinted it was slowing down. The pilots exchanged brief glances, trying to make sense of the disagreement. In aviation, conflicting data is dangerous, not because of the numbers themselves, but because it forces humans to choose which version of reality to trust. The autopilot suddenly disengaged. A sharp warning tone filled the cockpit as the control column stiffened in the pilot's hands. Manual control had returned instantly, without the gentle transition pilots prefer. The aircraft reacted slightly nose up, an almost unnoticeable movement but enough to change how the air flowed over the wings. The crew reacted quickly, applying standard procedures, unaware that the information guiding their actions was already compromised. The plane climbed. Not dramatically, not violently, just enough to feel wrong. Engine thrust increased automatically as the systems attempted to compensate. The aircraft was now responding to data that no longer reflected the real world outside. The air was thinner at this altitude, and small errors here carried massive consequences. Then came another warning. This one was louder. More urgent. A stall alert, brief, then silent, then sounding again. The pilots hesitated. A stall at this altitude, at this speed, made no sense based on what they were seeing. One pilot voiced confusion. Another tried to override the system's response. In that moment, precious seconds slipped away. The aircraft began to shudder. Not turbulence, something different. A subtle vibration, the kind pilots fear because it signals aerodynamic instability. The nose was still high. Airspeed readings continued to fluctuate wildly. The crew adjusted the controls again, unknowingly pushing the aircraft deeper into danger. Behind them, in the passenger cabin, nothing seemed wrong yet. Seatbelt signs were on. The ride felt rough but manageable. No screams. No panic. Just a plane flying through the dark. But the black box was listening. Every breath. Every uncertain word. Every decision made under pressure. And what it was recording told a story far more terrifying than anyone on board could imagine. The aircraft was now flying in a state that defied instinct. The nose remained raised, yet the plane was losing energy. To the pilots, the sensation was deeply confusing. The control inputs they were making felt correct based on their training and the information in front of them, but the aircraft's behavior told a different story. The more they tried to stabilize it, the less responsive it became. Another warning sounded, then disappeared. The stall alert cut in and out, its inconsistency making it even more dangerous. In aviation, a warning that stops can be more misleading than one that continues. One pilot questioned whether the alarm itself was malfunctioning. The other focused on maintaining altitude, believing the aircraft was descending too fast. Both were reacting logically, yet both were reacting to a false picture. The plane climbed again. At high altitude, this was fatal. The air was too thin to support such an attitude, and the wings were no longer producing enough lift. The aircraft wasn't falling like a stone, it was sinking, trapped in an invisible aerodynamic trap. The engines roared, but thrust could not fix a problem caused by airflow, not power. Inside the cockpit, voices grew sharper. Instructions overlapped. One pilot called out airspeed. Another announced altitude. The captain tried to piece together what was happening, but the information arriving was fragmented and contradictory. There was no clear reference point, no horizon, no visual cues, only black sky and instrument lights glowing against the darkness. Then the vertical speed increased. The plane began descending faster than before, thousands of feet per minute, even as the nose stayed up. This contradiction should have been a clue, but under stress, the human brain searches for familiar patterns. The pilots interpreted the descent as a need to pull up harder, not realizing they were deepening the stall. In the cabin, gravity shifted. Passengers felt the floor drop beneath them, followed by a heavy, uneasy floating sensation. Objects rattled. Drinks tipped. Confusion spread, but still no one understood the truth unfolding above. The black box continued recording. It captured hesitation. It captured confusion. And it captured the exact moment when the aircraft crossed a threshold from recoverable to nearly impossible. By now, the aircraft was fully trapped in a high-altitude stall, though no one in the cockpit had clearly identified it yet. The warning system, designed to alert pilots of danger, was no longer reliable. As airspeed readings dropped below certain thresholds, the stall warning stopped entirely, not because the stall had ended, but because the system itself could no longer calculate correctly. The silence was deadly. The pilots took this silence as reassurance. Believing the stall condition had passed, they continued holding the nose high, trying to arrest what felt like an uncontrolled descent. In reality, the aircraft was sinking faster with every second. The wings were no longer flying, they were simply falling through thin air. control inputs still moved the aircraft, but only slightly, like steering a car on ice. Inside the cockpit, breathing became heavy. Voices tightened. Every pilot action was now reactive rather than deliberate. Training manuals could not prepare anyone for this level of sensory conflict. Altitude dropping rapidly, nose pointed upward, engines at high power, and no clear explanation as to why nothing was working. The captain demanded clarity. What's happening? But there was no simple answer. One pilot called out vertical speed. Another focused on pitch. A third tried to analyze airspeed. Each was correct in isolation, yet wrong as a whole. The aircraft's systems were feeding them fragments of truth, not the full picture. And without a shared understanding, coordination began to break down. The descent rate increased again. 10,000 feet lost. Then more. The aircraft shook violently, not from turbulence, but from airflow separating over the wings. This was the physical signature of a deep stall, one of the most dangerous conditions an aircraft can enter. Recovery required a precise sequence of actions, executed calmly and immediately. But calm was no longer available. Below them, the ocean waited, dark, endless, invisible. Above them, the storm offered no escape. And inside the aircraft, the black box kept recording, capturing every strained breath and every second of delay that brought the plane closer to a point of no return. The aircraft was now falling through the sky in a condition few pilots ever experience and even fewer survive. Despite the nose being raised, the descent rate continued to increase. The engines were producing thrust, but thrust alone could not restore lift. The laws of aerodynamics had taken control, indifferent to human effort or intent. Inside the cockpit, time seemed distorted. Seconds felt like minutes. Each new instrument reading demanded attention, yet none provided clarity. One display showed dangerously low airspeed. Another suggested a value that made no sense at all. The pilots debated which numbers were real, unaware that the most important truth was not on any screen. The aircraft was stalled deeply and continuously. The captain attempted to reassert command. He issued firm instructions, trying to stabilize the crew's actions. But the situation had already fragmented decision-making. Control inputs overlapped. One pilot pushed slightly forward, another pulled back moments later. These opposing actions cancelled each other out, preventing any meaningful recovery. The aircraft remained locked in its fatal attitude. Another sudden shudder ran through the fuselage. Loose objects rattled violently. Structural vibrations echoed through the cabin. The plane wasn't breaking apart, but it was screaming through motion. Aerodynamic buffeting shook the wings as airflow detached completely, turning the aircraft into little more than a falling object with engines attached. In the passenger cabin, fear was no longer subtle. People felt weightless one moment, pressed into their seats the next. Panic spread as screams filled the dark interior. Oxygen masks did not deploy. There was no announcement. Only confusion and terror, magnified by the silence from the cockpit. The pilots were running out of altitude. Every 1,000 feet lost reduced their options. Every delayed correction made recovery less likely. The aircraft passed through lower altitudes where air became denser, normally helpful, but by now, control authority was too degraded and coordination too fractured. The black box continued its relentless recording. It captured raised voices. It captured overlapping commands. And it captured the growing realization, spoken aloud, that the aircraft was no longer responding as expected. They were still flying, but they were no longer in control. As the aircraft dropped through lower altitudes, the environment outside began to change, but not in the way the pilots hoped. The air was denser now, which should have helped restore lift, yet the aircraft remained locked in a stalled state. The reason was brutally simple: the nose was still too high. The wings could not reattach airflow until the angle was reduced, and that single correction never fully came. Inside the cockpit, urgency turned into desperation. The pilots' voices grew louder, sharper. Each call-out carried strain, not just fear but disbelief. The aircraft was doing something that contradicted everything they expected. Training had taught them that aircraft recover when power is added and altitude is protected. But here, those instincts were betraying them. Another attempt was made to stabilize the descent. For a brief moment, the vertical speed slowed. Hope flickered. But the relief was short-lived. As soon as the aircraft leveled slightly, the stall deepened again. The plane shuddered violently, pitching and rolling in small but terrifying movements. It was no longer a smooth descent, it was an uncontrolled fall masked as flight. In the cabin, chaos fully erupted. Passengers screamed as the plane dropped suddenly, then lurched upward. Overhead bins burst open. Loose luggage slammed into the ceiling before crashing back down. People grabbed whatever they could, bracing for an impact they could feel approaching but not see. Back in the cockpit, the realization finally surfaced. One of the pilots said it out loud, the word that explained everything. Stall. But recognition came too late. Recovering from a deep stall required a calm, coordinated response: nose down, reduce angle of attack, accept altitude loss. Instead, panic and conflicting control inputs continued. The aircraft responded sluggishly, as if resisting every command. Altitude warnings began sounding. The ocean was no longer an abstract threat. It was closing in fast. The black box recorded the shift in tone, the moment when problem-solving gave way to raw urgency. Breathing quickened. Commands shortened. Time compressed. The aircraft was still intact. The engines were still running. But control was slipping away with every second. The aircraft was now descending at a terrifying rate, the ocean rising rapidly beneath it. The altitude callouts echoed through the cockpit, each one louder and more urgent than the last. What had once been numbers on a screen were now a countdown. Every second shaved away another chance at recovery. The pilots made one final series of control inputs. This time, the nose finally began to lower, but not enough. The correction was hesitant, fragmented by fear and uncertainty. Years of instinct screamed to pull up, to stop the fall, to save altitude. That instinct overpowered training once again. The wings never fully regained lift. The aircraft shuddered violently. Not turbulence. Not weather. This was airflow tearing away from the wings in uneven waves. The plane rolled slightly, then corrected, then rolled again. Structural warning sounds filled the cockpit, mixing with altitude alerts and engine noise. The sensory overload was complete. In the cabin, passengers were no longer questioning what was happening. They knew. Screams echoed as gravity vanished, returned, then vanished again. Some people were thrown upward against their restraints. Others were slammed back into their seats. The darkness, the noise, the sudden movements, everything combined into raw terror. In the cockpit, voices overlapped one last time. Short commands. Broken sentences. Shouted numbers. No one was thinking about procedures anymore. There was only reaction, pure, human, desperate reaction against forces that no longer cared. The aircraft dropped below 10,000 feet. There would be no controlled recovery now. Even a perfect correction at this altitude would take more time and space than they had left. The plane was descending too steeply, too fast. The black box continued recording without emotion. It captured the final attempts. It captured the final confusion. And it captured the moment when silence briefly replaced alarms, an eerie pause before the end. The ocean was directly below them now. Unseen. Unforgiving. Unavoidable. The final moments unfolded with terrifying speed. The aircraft was now plunging almost vertically, the ocean rushing upward through the darkness. The cockpit was filled with overlapping alarms, altitude warnings, system alerts, engine noise, all competing for attention, yet none offering a solution. The pilots were no longer trying to recover the aircraft. They were trying to understand how everything had collapsed so quickly. The nose dipped slightly again, just for a heartbeat. Had it happened minutes earlier, it might have saved them. Now, it changed nothing. The aircraft's speed surged, but there was no altitude left to convert that speed into lift. The wings sliced through dense air, but the trajectory was locked. Physics had already written the ending. Inside the cockpit, voices faltered. Commands trailed off mid-sentence. Breathing was heavy, uneven. One pilot called out altitude again, this time his voice cracked. The captain's final inputs were firm but futile, hands moving controls that no longer mattered. In the cabin, impact was imminent. Passengers braced instinctively. Some screamed. Some went silent. The aircraft's lights flickered as systems strained under extreme forces. The sound inside the fuselage was deafening, a mix of airflow, structural vibration, and the unmistakable roar of uncontrolled descent. Then, in the final seconds, something chilling happened. The alarms stopped. Not because danger had passed, but because there was no longer time for warnings. The aircraft was only moments from the surface. The ocean, black and endless, offered no reflection, no visual cue, only finality. The black box continued recording until the very last fraction of a second. It captured the final sound. It captured the final motion. And then, nothing. When the aircraft struck the ocean, there was no gradual breakup, no long struggle at the surface. The impact was sudden and absolute. At the speed and angle of descent, the fuselage shattered instantly, dispersing debris across the dark Atlantic. The force was so extreme that survival was impossible. In a single moment, the flight disappeared from the world. Silence followed. Above the ocean, the storm continued moving as if nothing had happened. No fireball lit the sky. No distress call was transmitted in the final seconds. Radar contact vanished without explanation, leaving air traffic controllers staring at empty screens, unaware that a tragedy had just unfolded. Hours passed before concern turned into alarm. When the aircraft failed to arrive at its destination and communication could not be re-established, search and rescue operations were launched. Planes and ships scanned the ocean below the flight path, searching for wreckage, survivors, any sign at all. For days, there was nothing. The Atlantic kept its secret well. When debris was finally found, it raised more questions than answers. Floating fragments of the aircraft, scattered over a vast area, suggested a high-energy impact. But without the flight recorders, investigators were left with theories instead of facts. Media speculation exploded. Was it weather? Terrorism? Structural failure? No one knew. Families waited. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. The absence of answers became its own form of torment. Every possibility was painful, every rumor cruel. The truth lay thousands of meters below the ocean's surface, locked inside two small devices designed to survive exactly this kind of catastrophe. Years later, when the black boxes were finally recovered from the ocean floor, they told a story no one expected. Not of a single dramatic failure. Not of an explosion. Not of sabotage. But of confusion. Of misunderstanding. And of a chain of small errors that quietly, relentlessly, led a perfectly functional aircraft into the sea. And what the black box revealed next would change aviation forever. The black box recordings revealed the chilling truth. It was not a mechanical catastrophe alone, nor a sudden storm surge that caused the crash. It was a combination of factors: a frozen pitot tube giving false airspeed readings, minor instrument failures, and the human instinct to react under extreme stress. Each small error compounded the next. Every split-second decision, made in darkness over the vast Atlantic, brought the plane closer to its fatal trajectory. Investigators meticulously analyzed the recordings. The pilots had fought valiantly, but confusion and conflicting data dominated the cockpit. The warnings were contradictory, the instruments unreliable. The plane, despite its advanced systems, could not compensate for the perfect storm of technical failure and human reaction. The lessons were profound. Aviation authorities worldwide reevaluated pilot training for high-altitude stalls. Sensor design, cockpit alerts, and emergency protocols were scrutinized and upgraded. Flight 447 became a landmark case study, a tragedy that reshaped the rules of modern aviation safety. It proved that even the most advanced aircraft could fall victim to a series of small, compounding issues when conditions aligned against them. The world mourned 228 lives lost. Families, friends, and colleagues of passengers and crew faced unbearable grief. The Atlantic swallowed both the aircraft and a sense of security, leaving a permanent mark on aviation history. Yet the tragedy also ensured that the mistakes of Flight 447 would never be repeated in the same way. Flight 447 remains a haunting reminder of the fragile balance between technology, human decision-making, and nature. The black box revealed more than just the mechanics of a crash. It revealed how quickly certainty can vanish in the sky, and how critical every second becomes when life is measured in altitude and airspeed. The truth had finally surfaced. And it was terrifying.